The Trump administration has struck a deal with Canada and Mexico to lift tariffs on steel and aluminum being shipped to the U.S. President Trump imposed the tariffs a year ago, citing national security concerns. The tariffs were a response to what the president called a flood of excess Chinese products in global markets. The agreement removes a key obstacle to passing a new trade deal known as the USMCA. It could also jolt the negotiations with China on trade. Joining me tonight, Amna Nawaz, national correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Philip Rucker, Washington bureau chief for the Washington Post. Susan Davis, congressional correspondent for NPR. And Hans Nichols, correspondent for NBC News. You have all the sides coming together on this, trying to get a deal. Does this now grease the skids for the USMCA on Capitol Hill?
It was a very good week for the president on Capitol Hill in terms of his trade agenda. And part of that is because his trade rep, Robert Lighthizer, came up to the Hill purposely to meet with Democrats, met with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a number of other Democrats. And I think there was a lot of skepticism going into that meeting. And I think that Democrats came out of that meeting thinking that this administration, and particularly Lighthizer, are very committed to getting this done. His message to Democrats was, what do I need to do to get you on board? They know they need Nancy Pelosi to bring this up to the floor, and I think they recognize that. And I would say in sort of the ebb and flow of what can this Congress do with this president, at the end of this week, I talked to more Democrats who thought trade was much more of a possibility than some of the other things that have been mentioned.
When could a vote happen, Sue?
I think everybody says anything that's going to happen substantively in this Congress probably has to happen this year. By the time you get into a presidential election year, I think next year the chances get slimmer. Nancy Pelosi said she's not in any rush, so I can't imagine it happens anytime soon. But I think if you're going to start to see movement on it, the fall is probably a time.
Well, this wasn't the only movement, Hans, on trade this week. We also had the president saying we'll have a 6-month delay for the Europeans, the European Union, and Japan on the auto tariffs.
So the president doesn't want to fight a multi-front war. So what we saw, today in the morning, he says 6-month delay, as you mentioned, and then with Canada and Mexico, he says, look, we're suing for peace, right? We are going to have some sort of agreement. It's unclear to me what actually changed on the substance from when the president decided to put those tariffs in against Mexico and Canada and what actually happened now. Did we actually extract anything? But the president gets to focus all of his energy on China. And when you talk to administration officials, it's so clear that what they really want to do is fundamentally alter the relationship with China. It's salted throughout the president's speeches. It's in his rhetoric pretty much every time he addresses it. He almost seems more comfortable without a deal with China than he does with it. He can live in a world where there are tariffs for quite some time. And even if he can't, he wants to send the message that he can, and that's, I think, what we saw this week very clearly.
You say the deals may not have changed that much, but maybe the markets changed, Phil, and did that influence the White House as they proceeded on trade?
I think it has. You're seeing the president be slightly more cautious now, delaying those auto tariffs with Europe and Japan, lifting these tariffs with Mexico and Canada. He's a little bit spooked, I think, by the markets, and it also goes to the 2020 reelection plan. He believes he gets reelected if the economy is strong and humming, and right now we're seeing agitation, we're seeing nerves on Wall Street, and a sense that maybe all of these trade wars coming together at the same time without a lot of certainty and clear forward agenda could rattle markets and have an economic impact that hurts the president politically.
Talking about 2020, Amna, you just got back from reporting on the road in Iowa. A lot of farmers there and their senator in Iowa, Chuck Grassley, have been very unhappy with the tariffs on Mexico and Canada because you saw the Mexican government, for example, have retribution against farmers and have their own retaliation. Now that this is somewhat coming to a peace agreement on trade, what does that mean for farmers in the Midwest?
It's important to point out, too, farmers, a lot of folks in the agricultural field felt a lot of the effects of those tariffs first and early, as usually happens. It's also important to note some of the other tariffs have a bit of lag time before they reach the everyday American consumer. And one of the things we saw this week was some of those folks who speak to what the consumer landscape could be, those major CEOs of places like Walmart and Macy's, on their earnings call saying, we think we have no choice but to start to raise prices very soon. I can't help but think that contributed to some pressure on the president and this White House to say maybe we need to ease up a little bit, because when these tariffs really start to trickle down to Main Street, to the average American consumer, that's where it starts to blow back on them.
But can there actually be a trade deal on Capitol Hill if you have a White House this week saying we're not going to cooperate with Congress, with Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, blocking any request. We had just news Friday afternoon. The Treasury Secretary is not going to hand over the president's tax returns. So you have an all-out fight on the Mueller front still, even though the report's been completed. Does that hover over everything on trade?
Absolutely. I mean, it changes the posture between the administration and Congress, because you have the White House basically blocking all oversight investigations from the Hill. And so Pelosi, as you just said, Sue, is going to take her time on this trade deal. She's in no hurry. And that might be because she wants to try to use that as some leverage and see what she can get out of the administration and the White House to break this logjam.
But also remember, trade is one of these issues where the ideological curve sort of bends between Trump and a lot of Democrats. In some ways, his trade agenda has upset Republican orthodoxy more than Democrats. He has natural allies here. He has natural allies in Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate as well, who has always been tough on China and is one of those issues where the president, if he chooses to work with Democrats, will find some willing partners. I do think that Republicans in the Senate will have to realize that this is going to have to be a trade deal that can pass with Nancy Pelosi's vote. And that means a very different looking trade deal than what maybe Mitch McConnell would write. But I also think Republicans have shown that if the president's on board, they get in line.
So the